Time when a hamburger cost 15 cents. A movie was around 85 cents. The average American family made $6,200 a year. A stamp cost 5 cents. Gas was 30 cents a gallon. That was 1963. The innocence of the 50s was gone, replaced with a restlessness for change and an idealism about the future. American Dreams transports us back to that time and place in American life when it seemed anything was possible. During the years covered by Season 1, 1963 and 1964, change was everywhere you looked, and families like the Pryors struggled to keep up and hold on. The years 1963 and 1964 marked a turning point, a moment in time when our nation left behind completely the steadiness and quiet of the 1950s and began to hurtle headlong into that chaotic time we now think of as America in the 60s. The only constant in those years was change, the roles of women and the roles of minorities.
I have a dream today.
Both began radical shifts. Music was changing.
We think it's good.
Even movies took on a new edge.
Love the bomb. A moving picture.
And there was a dark side to those years, those changes. In politics came the kind of violent, frightening change America had rarely witnessed. Season 1 of American Dreams begins with the Pryors of Philadelphia huddled around the TV set, stunned at the moment that would shake America out of the calm 1950s forever. In November 1963, President Kennedy and the First Lady traveled to Dallas, Texas. His motorcade wound its way through the downtown streets, passing thousands of cheering well-wishers. But at 12:30 Central Time, just as the president's car turned into Dealey Plaza, suddenly shots rang out and President Kennedy slumped down into his wife's lap.
Bob is at the hospital in Dallas, where the president has been rushed. The president is seriously wounded.
Officials at the hospital say the president has been given a transfusion of B-positive blood. They are calling for fresh blood of that type to have it ready if additional transfusions were needed.
Details were trickling in slowly.
We've checked with the White House, which has told us it doesn't know any more than we know, and in fact has been listening to us to see what it could find out.
But at 1 in the afternoon, the dreadful news became clear.
The memory of every person listening at this moment has flashed back to that day in April 1945 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt...
Excuse me, Chet. Here is a flash from the Associated Press, Dateline Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
It was the first presidential assassination of the television age. Jerry Blavat, the legendary Philadelphia disc jockey, remembers the day like it was yesterday.
I was doing a radio show from my basement. And Friday night, I would run a dance at the Chevu Ballroom, which was at 69th and Market with 2,000 kids. It happened in the afternoon when I got the news. And I canceled the dance that night. And I stood outside with kids coming lined around the blocks and said, there's going to be no dance tonight, out of respect for the assassination of a president. And kids stayed home and watched television for that entire weekend.
America struggled to make sense of it all.
There are some things that are simply incredible and leave one absolutely speechless. This is one of them.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson will be given the oath of office as President of the United States as soon as it can be done.
At 2:38 that afternoon, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One. Standing by his side was Jacqueline Kennedy, her clothes still stained with her husband's blood. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. Flanked by police on his way to jail, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot him on live television.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Oswald came out. He was asked, did you shoot the president or something along those lines? And at that hour, someone walked up to Oswald. At point-blank range, fired into his stomach.
The next day, the country mourned the 35th president and watched his young son, JFK Jr., salute his coffin. On November 27, 1963, President Johnson delivered his first address to a joint session of Congress, promising he would continue what JFK had started.
I am here today to say I need your help. I cannot bear this burden alone. I need the help of all Americans in all America.
In the months leading up to his assassination, the president confronted head-on issues that would set the tone for the rest of the decade and transform the world as the Pryor family knew it, for better and for worse. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered a speech in Germany at the Berlin Wall. He brought the crowd to its feet, proclaiming solidarity with the German people.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
And a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war, a diplomatic hotline was set up to avoid delays in communication between the two superpowers. It was a small but significant thaw in the Cold War. Then, in a famous speech at American University, Kennedy called for a halt to the arms race and made a pledge to the Soviet Union.
I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
Shortly after, Kennedy, along with Soviet President Khrushchev and Britain's Prime Minister Macmillan, signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It was the first time any agreement was reached on the limits of nuclear weapons.
If this treaty fails, it will not be our doing. And even if it fails, we shall not regret that we have made this clear and honorable national commitment to the cause of man's survival.
President Kennedy made the space program a priority, asking Congress to approve more than $22 billion in hopes the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Meanwhile, nearly 10,000 miles away in a little-known part of the world called Vietnam, the crisis was intensifying. A Buddhist monk protested President Diem's regime by lighting himself on fire at a busy intersection. On November 1, 1963, Diem and his brother were overthrown and murdered. By that time, there were 16,000 Americans in South Vietnam, special advisors sent to train the South Vietnamese army in how to fight the communist Viet Cong.
U.S. training seems to be paying off. They burned entire villages before retreating. This one on the Mekong Delta is wiped out. The government forces can do little but evacuate the villages. Vietnam, the jungle battleground that holds the fate of all Southeast Asia.
They keep thinking we begging them for something. We ain't begging for nothing. We're telling them what is ours right now.
Back home in the United States, another war was heating up as well.
We want it now!
In spring and summer of 1963, in cities across the country, civil rights activists were shaking things up. That April, a 34-year-old preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. led a group of demonstrators to the heart of Birmingham, Alabama, to protest segregation in that city.
Behind me is the 16th Street Baptist Church, the main staging area for the demonstration. On Good Friday, I had watched Dr. King lead a small anti-segregation march through this park.
Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, notorious for his racist views, had Martin Luther King arrested, inspiring even more marchers to take to the streets in nonviolent demonstrations. Hundreds more were arrested.
The students cut classes and took to the streets by the hundreds, following Dr. King's tactic of going to jail deliberately to dramatize the Negro protest against segregation.
But on May 3rd, 1963, there were too many to arrest. Instead, Connor took swift action, calling for brutal force to control the crowds.
We will use the dogs if they start drawing knives again and throwing rocks. We will use the hose if it becomes necessary to stop the mob.
President Kennedy called in federal troops to restore order, but the nationally televised pictures of water hoses and police dogs set on nonviolent marchers, many of them children, prompted a national outcry. Then, in June 1963, a showdown between the state and federal governments. Alabama Governor George Wallace, a staunch segregationist, stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama to prevent 2 black students from enrolling.
I stand for all the people of this state, and when I stand, I will be symbolic of all of those who oppose the omnipotent march of the central government toward trying to control every aspect and phase of our lives.
President Kennedy then federalized the Alabama National Guard and had them escort the students to school, ordering Governor Wallace to step aside.
This then is the moment when Governor George Wallace of Alabama walked away from the schoolhouse door.
5 minutes after the governor leaves, James Hood is the first of his race to become a University of Alabama student. He is followed into the registrar's office by Vivian Malone. Both the students are 20 years old and will take summer courses.
That night, June 11th, 1963, President Kennedy delivered a solemn address to the nation.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
8 days later, the president submitted to Congress the bill that would later result in the most far-reaching civil rights legislation in history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it seemed every step forward in the movement triggered new violence. A day after the 2 students strode through the doors of the University of Alabama, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was gunned down in his driveway.
15 minutes past midnight, Evers got out of his car beside his home in a Negro residential area. In a vacant lot about 40 yards away, a sniper fired a single shot from a high-powered rifle at Evers' silhouette. The bullet hit him in the back, crashed through his body, through a window into the house. He died within an hour at a Jackson hospital.
It was a body blow to the movement, but it set in motion one of the most important days in its history. After Evers' death, civil rights leaders met with President Kennedy, boldly announcing plans for a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. On August 28, 1963, marchers from all over the nation poured into the capital city.
They moved today 200,000 strong down a broad and tree-shaded avenue in Washington, D.C., softly singing and chanting the hymns born of their movement and those that have gone before. There were no ranks, but they were orderly. They moved with dignity, but there was no sternness. Their placards demanded the uprooting of every vestige of discrimination and said it must be done now, but they showed no anger.
Reverend Martin Luther King was the last speaker that day, his soaring voice delivering the unforgettable words that echoed across the nation.
I have a dream today.
The following year, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Meanwhile, another powerful voice named Malcolm X was arguing against nonviolence and black integration into white society. Malcolm X favored a more militant form of social protest and urged blacks to stop imitating white behavior.
Negroes get drunk because they see white people get drunk. They smoke cigarettes because they see white people smoke cigarettes. They commit fornication and adultery because when they turn on the television, all they see is a white man committing fornication and adultery. So, and they want to be like the white man, so they copy his immoral social habits. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad comes along and teaches black people the glory of black.
Soon, the Pryor family of American dreams would encounter the restlessness of the times when race riots arrived at their backyard, Philadelphia, the summer of 1964. But even with all the racial imbalance of the time, there were triumphs. A young actor named Sidney Poitier broke through the color barrier to take home the first Oscar ever awarded to a black man for Best Actor in the 1963 movie Lilies of the Field.
The winner is Sidney Poitier.
Mr. Poitier is the first Negro to win such a high award, and the announcement is received warmly by the audience. The winner is choked with emotion.
Because it is a long journey to this moment. I am naturally indebted to countless numbers of people. For all of them, all I can say is a very special thank you.
In 1963 and 64, the civil rights movement was making progress against injustice, and it proved ordinary people could achieve monumental change.
The word for today's woman is go. Go to the station, go to the meeting, go to the market, go with the volunteers, go, go, go. How does she do it? Just as Alcoa Wrap makes your kitchen tasks easier, so do all the time and work-saving products made possible by Alcoa Wrap packaging foil.
Another movement for change was slowly taking shape. In 1963, Betty Friedan's groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, was published. It would articulate the dissatisfaction that millions of educated housewives were feeling. Friedan described it as the problem with no name.
I would get these letters, and they'd say, I was making dinner for the kids, and I had bought your book, and I started reading it, and I couldn't stop, and my husband came home and said, where's dinner? And I said, well, you make it. I've decided to go back to school.
In season 1 of American Dreams, Helen Pryor experienced a similar emotion, and more women of the time were confronting it. The struggle between her own ambitions and home life. Helen would decide to go back to school against her husband's wishes.
You still haven't given this thing back to that college friend of yours?
No. It's mine.
For what?
I was thinking about taking a class on Tuesdays and Thursdays instead of book club, and I've worked it out, and I can get everything done that I need to get done and still get home in time to cook dinner.
So this is what you're gonna do now? This?
Many women who went back to work around this time found the workplace an uneven playing field. In 1963, women earned 59 cents for every dollar men earned in the same job. It wasn't until President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act on June 10, 1963, that equal pay for equal work became law. And yet another revolution was brewing in the early 60s, the youth movement. Inspired by causes like civil rights, students were taking action all across college campuses in the fight for human rights and a free democratic society. Young people everywhere answered the call of their idealistic president who challenged them 2 years earlier.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
They questioned authority in peaceful protests or joined the newly created Peace Corps. Kennedy himself was a role model, symbolizing the optimism of youth.
He was young, he was sharp, he was hip. Young people loved him because America was a young country. And here was a young president bringing the message of what America was.
Something else energized the youth movement as well, the birth control pill. It was just 3 years old by 1963, and the sexual revolution it would spark was just around the bend. The soulful and socially conscious lyrics of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan spoke to millions. While at home, American families were glued to one of the 56 million television sets, watching mainstream shows like The Beverly Hillbillies, Dick Van Dyke, and Bonanza, one of the only shows televised in color. On weekdays and Saturdays, they could twist and shout to American Bandstand, broadcast live from Philadelphia. At that time, Philadelphia DJ Jerry Blavat was a scrawny kid from the neighborhood and one of the show's original dancers.
When I went up on Bandstand, I lied about my age and I got in because you had to be 14 and I was 13. And I got in and I won a couple of dance contests. And because of that, I became one of the most popular kids on Bandstand.
It was a dream come true for the kids that got to dance to rock and roll and for the millions of viewers tuning in every week.
It was the first time that kids danced to rock and roll music on TV. Up until that time, kids were not, there were record hops, school hops, but nobody saw kids dancing to this music. And Dick Clark was probably the most single important faction for the recording industry. The music now was being heard, and Dick Clark was breaking records, and kids that danced on Bandstand became stars.
For the young girl and boy sitting at home, Bandstand was their show.
The older people had the soap operas, all right? The variety shows were Ed Sullivan, Arthur Godfrey. Bandstand was a kid's show. He heard the music, he saw the artist, and he learned how to dance by watching that show.
It was a time when families sat down together for dinner and gathered around the television set, a time when neighbors looked out for one another.
There was dignity, there was respect, and you knew what you could do, and you knew what you couldn't do. If you stepped out of line, if you were in the neighborhood, you didn't have to worry about your parents. Your neighbor would say, if I tell your mother, I tell your father. No, no, please, I won't do it again. I won't do it again. We grew up in a wonderful time. Bandstand reflected those times, you see.
Favorite movies of the time included Tom Jones, America, America, Lawrence of Arabia, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, and Cleopatra. The epic movie starring Elizabeth Taylor was the most expensive film ever made.
On your knees. You dare ask the proconsul of Rome?
I asked it of Julius Caesar. I demand it of you.
In 1964, Dr. Strangelove mocked the politics of the day with a satirical look at life in the nuclear age.
Has that plane really got a chance of getting through?
Well, sir, if the pilot's good, see? I mean, if he's really sharp, he can barrel that baby in so low. I mean, you ought to see it sometime. It's a sight. A big plane like a 52 room.
And stars like Tony Randall, Doris Day, Rock Hudson, and Marlon Brando captured the glamour of the red carpet in what was still a black and white era. The sleek and sexy 63 Corvette made its debut. So did a new remote control model from Zenith.
After a hard day at the office, a man wants to relax. That's why Zenith Space Command is so wonderful, for it lets you tune TV without moving from your easy chair.
The most popular songs in the country were Sugar Shack and Surfin' USA, and Jerry Blavat remembers a few others.
Dawn by the Four Seasons, Twist and Shout by the Isley Brothers, Heat Wave by Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. These were the real big songs in Philadelphia.
But it was a phenomenon overseas that would soon make its way to American shores, Beatlemania.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
They were new, something completely different, with the way they dressed, the way they sang, and the look that they had. And young kids went wild for them.
New York City cops are hard-pressed protecting the Beatles at their hotel. On every side, there is hero worship that recalls the heydays of Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra.
The Beatles first appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. I Wanna Hold Your Hand went straight to the top of the charts. Jerry Blavat remembers when the Fab Four came to Philadelphia, hometown of the Pryor family.
Mom, I'm a Beatle. I knew it. Well, you're not a Beatle.
Bobby Vinton holds number 4 position. Leslie Gore with You Don't Own Me, number 2, She Loves You by the Beatles, and this is the number 1 record.
They came to Convention Hall, and of course it was completely sold out. And I was brought on stage. Ed McMahon was the announcer who brought them on, and Ed was from Philadelphia. And I took a bow, you know, with the Beatles.
Their return to Britain was met with equal enthusiasm on the other side of the Atlantic.
And here they are, fresh from their triumphant appearances in the United States. 12,000 young Britons roar a welcome. Our staff scientist, in an odd moment, calculated that this young mob is generating enough energy to put 3 Atlas missiles in orbit and power 54,000 transistor radios.
Even in a time of sweeping changes, the small things are worth noting as well. It was back in 1963 that the post office introduced a Zone Improvement Program, or ZIP, to expedite mail delivery.
If you've had the feeling lately that the country seems to be getting a little more crowded, you're right.
The population of America climbed to 190 million.
This is the scene from coast to coast as baby food manufacturers go on round-the-clock shifts.
The infamous prison Alcatraz closed its doors.
It's hail and farewell to Alcatraz. The dread rock in San Francisco Bay plays host to the press on its closing day. For the first time in its long penal history, reporters and cameramen are allowed to roam its innermost cell blocks and cells at will.
The Surgeon General issued the first report linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer.
It is a judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
And on April 22, 1964, the World's Fair opened in Queens, New York, with some interesting activities for children.
Here the kids and the kids alone can take active part in working atomic devices. Then they can go prospecting for uranium. Find the hidden buttons and you can spot the deposits.
In sports, Willie Mays was a wonder on the baseball field.
There are cries of "Go, Willie, go," and go he does, winding up at second with a stolen base.
23-year-old Jack Nicklaus was a golf sensation.
He sends his ball sailing. You can buy a lot of golf balls for $50,000. Not bad for playing 36 holes of pasture pool.
I am the greatest.
And Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay, defeated Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion of the world.
15 times I have told the clown what round he's going down, and this chump ain't no different. He'll fall in 8 to prove that I'm great. And if he keeps talking jive, I'm going to cut it to 5.
He would later give up that hard-won title rather than go to war in Vietnam, a war that by the summer of 1964 was already inevitable.
I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution making it clear that our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
Thousands of young Americans, just like J.J. Pryor in American Dreams, would join the U.S. military with no idea how long they'd be there or how bloody the conflict would be.
What if they send you to war?
Then I'll fight.
For now, there was still that idealism that drove the American dream. The tide was changing. There would be many more turbulent years ahead, but 63 and 64 were the years when America's voices were just beginning to be heard. Those voices still resonate today.